The holographic battlefield flickered to life with the kind of brutal clarity that made even veteran cadets wince. Kepler 438b materialized in the Academy's main simulation chamber. Red dirt, twisted metal, and the ghostly afterimages of a battle that had ended 3 years ago. Professor Zorin adjusted his ceremonial war ribbons and cleared his throat, a sound like grinding stone that always preceded his most dramatic lectures. "Cadets, observe carefully," he rumbled, his forearms gesturing toward the carnage. "The Kepler 448b incident represents the single greatest military catastrophe in recent galactic history. 2 battle fleets gone, 12,000 personnel lost, 0 survivors." The simulation played out in horrifying detail. Ships exploded in silent fury, soldiers fell. The red dirt turned redder. Cadet Jix Vollen leaned forward, his aquatic features glistening under the hollow light. "Professor, the tactical manuals say that Terran forces were completely eliminated in the first wave. How did we even get battlefield recordings?" "Excellent question." Zorn's eyes, all 6 of them, gleamed with academic pride. "Automated drones captured everything before they too were destroyed by the Zarathi death pulse weapons. This simulation is rebuilt from their final transmissions." That's when a small hand shot up from the back row. Professor?" The voice was distinctly human, with that peculiar accent that always made the other species do double takes. "Your timeline is off by about 3 minutes. Every head in the chamber turned. Corporal Lauren Doc Shawn sat with the casual posture of someone commenting on the weather, not disputing official military records. Her human features looked impossibly young next to her alien classmates. Smooth skin, bright eyes, the kind of face that belonged in a university cafeteria, not a war zone. Professor Zorin's mandibles clicked in irritation. "I beg your pardon, Cadet Shawn? The Zarathi didn't deploy death pulse weapons until 1432 local time. Your simulation has them firing at 1429. Lawrence's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone correcting a grocery list. "Also, the human medic station wasn't where you've got it marked. It was about 15 meters northeast. Behind that ridge there." The silence stretched like a held breath. Cadet Nera Keltis, whose dragon-like species prided itself on military precision, spoke first. "How could you possibly know those details?" Lauren blinked, looking genuinely confused by the question. "Because I was there." The simulation froze mid-explosion. Professor Zorin's primary hands gripped his lectern. "That's impossible. There were no survivors from Kepler 438b. The official reports are mostly accurate," Lauren interrupted, not rudely, but with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Just incomplete. Look, can you rewind to 1345? There's about to be a massive tactical error that your textbooks completely miss." The professor's academic world was tilting off its axis. He'd built his entire career on the study of military disasters, and here was a 19-year-old human exchange student casually rewriting galactic history from memory. "Cadet Shawn," he said slowly, "are you claiming you were present during the Kepler 438b massacre?" "Massacre?" Lauren's eyebrows went up. "Is that what you're calling it?" "Huh, we always just called it Tuesday." Cadet Pex Quantum, speaking in the unified voice of their hive mind, buzzed with electronic confusion. "The records indicate total annihilation of all ground forces within 6 hours of initial contact." "Yeah, it was pretty rough," Lauren agreed, pulling out a worn data pad. "Though, if we're being technical, the fighting lasted closer to 18 hours. And it wasn't total annihilation, more like strategic disaster with a side of everyone screaming and running around on fire." She scrolled through what looked like personal notes. "See, this is why I keep a combat journal. Memory gets fuzzy when people are shooting at you." The simulation chamber had gone dead quiet except for the low hum of suspended holoparticles. 200 alien cadets stared at the small human in the back row, who was treating their most studied military catastrophe like a minor scheduling conflict. Professor Zorin felt his carefully constructed lesson plan crumbling. "If you were truly there, Cadet Sean, perhaps you could elaborate on the tactical situation?" Lauren shrugged. "Sure, but you're going to want to sit down for this. The official version makes it sound like the Zerathi caught everyone by surprise. That's not exactly what happened." She stood up, somehow commanding the attention of the entire chamber despite being half the size of most of her classmates. "Mind if I drive this thing? Your simulation is missing some pretty important details." Before the professor could object, Lauren had already stepped forward to the control console. Her fingers moved across the interface with practiced ease. "There we go," she murmured, and suddenly the battlefield transformed. Where before there had been chaos and confusion, now there were clear defensive positions, improvised medical stations, and what looked suspiciously like organized resistance. The simulation rewound to show small groups of figures, humans, coordinating under impossible fire, dragging wounded to safety, turning certain death into merely probable death. "You see that ridgeline?" Lauren pointed to a seemingly insignificant rock formation. "That's where Captain Voss made her stand. Officially, she died in the first 10 minutes. Actually, she held that position for 6 hours while we evacuated the wounded. Cadet Drix's aquatic features had gone pale blue, his species equivalent of shock. "You evacuated wounded? From a battle with 0 survivors?" "Well," Lauren said with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both modest and terrifying, 0 official survivors. But you know how paperwork can be." The chamber erupted in whispers, clicks, and electronic buzzing as dozens of alien species tried to process what they were hearing. Professor Zorin gripped his lectern so hard his knuckles turned white. "Cadet Sean," he said carefully, "are you telling us that the foundational case study of our military disaster course isn't actually a disaster?" Lauren tilted her head, considering. "Oh, it was definitely a disaster. People died, good people, friends of mine." Her voice went quiet for a moment, and something hard flickered behind her eyes. "But disasters and defeats aren't the same thing, Professor." She turned back to the simulation, her small human hands adjusting parameters with surgical precision. "Besides," she added, almost as an afterthought, "whoever told you there were 0 survivors clearly never filed a proper after-action report." The simulation flickered, and suddenly the chamber was filled with something no one had expected to see. Hope. Small figures moving with purpose through the carnage. Impossible rescues. Last stands that somehow weren't so last after all. And in the middle of it all, a 19-year-old medic with steady hands and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that was starting to make the entire Galactic Military Academy very, very nervous. Professor Zorin looked at his lesson notes, then at the human cadet who had just rewritten them in real time. "Class dismissed," he said weakly. "I need to make some calls," but nobody moved. They were all staring at Lauren, who was still adjusting the simulation with the casual competence of someone who'd lived through it. And that's when the real questions started. The Galactic Military Academy's administrative wing had never seen this much chaos outside of an actual invasion. Admiral Kisnethera paced behind her desk like a caged predator, her Centaurian features sharp with barely controlled panic. 3 emergency meetings had been called in the past hour, and her secure comm was lighting up with calls from High Command, the Historical Archives, and at least 4 different intelligence agencies, all because of one human exchange student who apparently treated galactic military disasters like pop quizzes. "Run it by me again," Admiral Nethera said to her aide, a nervous insectoid named Clicks who kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. Slowly, Corporal Lauren Sean, Terran Defense Force, assigned to our academy under the Cultural Exchange Protocol 6 months ago. 19 years old, field medic certification, exemplary academic record. Click's compound eyes flickered with confusion. And according to Professor Zorin, she just corrected the Kepler 438b simulation. From personal experience, the Admiral stopped pacing. Personal experience. Yes, Mum, she claims she was there during the battle. As a medic, Admiral Nethera stared at the report on her desk. Lauren Shawn's file was remarkably ordinary. Young, bright, the kind of promising student the exchange program was designed to produce. Nothing about secret military operations or classified combat experience. How old was she 3 years ago during Kepler 438b? 16, Mom. The Admiral's headache was getting worse. We're talking about a battle where trained special forces units were obliterated, and you're telling me Earth sent a 16-year-old? It appears so, Mom. Before Admiral Nethera could respond, her office door chimed. Enter, she called, expecting another panicked aide or confused professor. Instead, Lauren Shawn walked in. She looked even smaller in person, barely reaching the Admiral's shoulder, wearing a standard academy uniform that seemed slightly too big for her frame. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a kind of steady alertness that made Admiral Nethera's military instincts sit up and take notice. You wanted to see me, Ma'am? Lauren's voice was polite, respectful, and completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just caused a minor institutional crisis. Cadet Shawn, the Admiral gestured to a chair. Please, sit. We need to discuss your intervention in Professor Zorin's class today. Lauren settled into the chair with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to conserve energy. Was I out of line, Mom? I tried to be respectful, but the simulation had some pretty significant errors. Errors? Admiral Nethera sat down across from her. You're claiming the official historical record of one of the worst military disasters in recent memory contains errors? Well, yeah. Lauren pulled out her worn datapad. Though I guess errors isn't quite right. More like incomplete information. She scrolled through what looked like detailed personal notes, complete with timestamps, casualty reports, and tactical assessments, written in the kind of shorthand only someone who'd been there would use. See, the problem with military history is that it's usually written by people who weren't getting shot at, Lauren continued conversationally. The official reports came from General Kreit's command post, which was evacuated pretty early in the engagement, so he missed most of the interesting parts. Admiral Nethera felt like she was having a conversation with a veteran officer, not a teenage exchange student. The interesting parts? You know, the parts where people didn't die. Lauren's tone went matter-of-fact. Captain Voss's last stand. Sergeant Kim's explosive improvisation with the fuel depot. The way Torres held that choke point for 3 hours with a broken leg and a medical scanner. She paused and something flickered across her face. Grief, maybe, or just the weight of carrying other people's stories. The records say 12,000 dead, 0 survivors. But that's not really accurate. It was more like 10,000 dead, 1,500 wounded, and about 500 who made it to the emergency evacuation zones. The Admiral's secure comm buzzed. She ignored it. Cadet Shawn, she said carefully, are you telling me that 2,000 people survived Kepler 438b? Give or take? Lauren shrugged. I mean, some of the wounded didn't make it, and there were a few who got listed as missing instead of KIA. Bureaucracy, you know. The comm buzzed again. This time, Admiral Nethera answered it. Admiral Nethera. Ma'am, this is Commander Rask Delmont, Military Intelligence. We need to speak with your exchange student immediately. The Admiral looked at Lauren, who was examining her fingernails with the kind of studied casualness that suggested she'd been expecting this call. How immediately? Admiral Nethera asked. We're in the lobby. 10 minutes later, Lauren sat in interview room C, facing 2 of the most intimidating intelligence officers in the Galactic Alliance. Commander Rask Delmont was a Velkarian like Professor Zorin, but where the professor was academic, Delmont was all sharp edges and predatory focus. His partner, Agent Yela Morse, was an android whose optical sensors could detect micro-expressions and stress patterns with terrifying accuracy. Lauren sipped her coffee. She'd asked for coffee, which had apparently thrown them off their script, and waited. Corporal Shawn, Commander Delmont began, we need to discuss your service record, okay? Specifically the parts that aren't in your service record. Ah. Lauren set down her coffee cup. Yeah, That happens sometimes with classified operations. Paperwork gets weird. Agent Morse leaned forward, her optical sensors focusing with an audible whir. Are you claiming that your presence at Kepler 4.8b was part of a classified operation? I'm not claiming anything. I'm just saying that sometimes when bad things happen, the paperwork gets creative afterward. Lauren's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath it now. Especially when the people writing the reports weren't there to see what actually happened. Commander Delmont activated a recording device. For the record, please state your role during the Kepler 438b engagement. Field medic, attached to Captain Elena Voss's unit, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, Terran Defense Force. Lauren's voice shifted into the clipped cadence of someone giving an official report. Mission parameters: medical support for reconnaissance patrol. Duration: 18 hours 43 minutes. Casualties treated: 216. The silence stretched. 216, Agent Morse repeated. Yes, ma'am. Would you like me to break that down by injury type and severity? Commander Delmont's hands, all four of them, were clenched on the table. Cadet, the official casualty reports from Kepler 438b indicate that medical personnel were among the first killed in the initial bombardment. The official reports, Lawrence said with infinite patience, are wrong. She leaned back in her chair, and for a moment she looked every bit the tired veteran despite her 19 years. Look, I get it. Nobody wants to admit that Earth sent teenagers to fight aliens. It looks bad in the reports. Makes people ask uncomfortable questions about our training programs and recruitment standards. Her voice went dry. Much easier to say everyone died heroically and leave it at that. Agent Morse's sensors were working overtime trying to detect deception. Our analysis indicates you're telling the truth as you understand it, but the facts you're presenting are incompatible with verified intelligence. Lauren reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a standard military med scanner, but battered and scarred in ways that spoke of hard use under harsh conditions. This scanner logged every patient I treated, she said simply. Names, injuries, treatment protocols, outcomes. It's all there in the memory core, encrypted with Terran Defense Force protocols. She placed it on the table between them. You want verified intelligence. There's 18 hours of it, including full biometric scans of everyone I kept alive while your official sources were writing death certificates. Commander Delmont stared at the scanner like it might explode. In terms of what it meant for galactic military history, it basically had. Why didn't you report this earlier? He asked. Why wait until a classroom discussion to reveal these discrepancies? Lauren looked genuinely puzzled. Report what? I filed my after-action report through proper channels 3 years ago. It's not my fault nobody read it. She stood up, somehow managing to look down at the two intelligence officers despite being the smallest person in the room. Besides, she added with a slight smile that was starting to become familiar around the academy, nobody asked. That's when Agent Morse's communication array lit up with priority signals from 17 different government agencies, all asking the same question. If the humans had been hiding survivors from Kepler 48b, what else might they be hiding? And in her dormitory later that night, Lauren Shawn sat at her desk, reviewing her homework, a tactical analysis of asymmetric warfare, while her roommate, a draconic cadet named Neera, stared at her like she'd sprouted a second head. You were really there, weren't you? Neera asked finally. Lauren looked up from her datapad. Where? Kepler 438b, the battle that killed 12,000 soldiers. You were actually there. Yeah. Lauren went back to her homework. Pass me that highlighter, would you? This section on resource management is completely wrong. Neera handed over the highlighter with hands that only trembled slightly. How are you so calm about this? Lauren paused in her highlighting. About what? About everything. You survived one of the worst military disasters in galactic history, and you're acting like it was a field trip. Well, Lauren said thoughtfully, it wasn't exactly a field trip. Field trips usually have better snacks. She returned to her homework, leaving Neera to grapple with the growing realization that her human roommate was possibly the most dangerous person on the station, and she was complaining about the quality of the cafeteria food. Outside their window, the Academy's communication arrays were lighting up the night sky with priority transmissions to every major military installation in the galaxy. The humans had been holding out on them. The question was, what else didn't they know? The emergency faculty meeting had been going for 3 hours, and Professor Zorin was beginning to understand why his ancestors had evolved 6 eyes. It was the only way to properly track all the different kinds of panic happening simultaneously around the conference table. "Let me understand this correctly," wheezed Dr. Venth Karras, the Academy's chief psychologist, his telepathic abilities apparently overwhelmed by the collective anxiety in the room. "We have been teaching military strategy based on incomplete data for 3 years?" "Not incomplete," corrected Instructor Grix, whose robotic voice carried the mechanical equivalent of exasperation. "Fabricated. The difference is significant." Admiral Nethra sat at the head of the table, looking like someone who'd aged a decade in a single day. "The question isn't how our intelligence was wrong. The question is why the humans let us believe it was right." Professor Zorin cleared his throat. "With respect, Admiral, I believe there's a more pressing question." He activated the wall display, showing Lauren's corrected simulation. "If this data is accurate, we need to completely re-evaluate our understanding of human combat psychology." The room fell silent as the simulation played. Where the original version had shown chaos and defeat, Lauren's corrections revealed something far more disturbing: organization under impossible conditions. Humans dragging wounded through enemy fire not because they had a chance of survival, but because abandoning them was apparently not an option their species could process. "This is tactically insane," muttered Commander Vex, the Academy's Strategic Studies Director. "Look at timestamp 1542. That human medic, your student, is performing surgery in an active combat zone, while being shot at, for a patient who has maybe a 5% chance of survival. And she saved him," Professor Zorin added quietly. "According to her notes, Corporal Williams made a full recovery." Dr. Karras leaned forward, his species' natural empathic abilities making him look faintly ill. "The psychological profile doesn't make sense. No rational species continues fighting when victory becomes mathematically impossible. It's evolutionary suicide. Unless," said a new voice from the doorway, "survival isn't actually the primary objective." Everyone turned to see Lauren Shawn standing at the entrance, still in her Academy uniform, but somehow looking far older than her 19 years. Behind her stood Captain Elena Voss, very much alive and wearing the insignia of a Terran Defense Force liaison officer. Admiral Nethra stood slowly. "Captain Voss, according to our records, you died at Kepler 438b. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Voss replied with a grin that was all teeth. "Though I did have a really bad day. Lauren here patched me up while I was bleeding out in a crater, then somehow got me to an evac point that officially didn't exist." She walked into the conference room with the easy confidence of someone who'd survived the impossible. "Mind if we join your little post-mortem? I hear you've been teaching My Last Stand as a cautionary tale about tactical overreach." Professor Zorin gestured weakly to empty chairs. The two humans sat down, and suddenly the room's entire dynamic shifted. The faculty, decorated veterans, strategic masterminds, beings who'd spent centuries studying warfare, found themselves feeling like students again. "You want to understand human combat psychology?" Captain Voss continued. "Here's your first lesson. We don't fight to win, we fight to make sure our people get home." She nodded to Lauren, who pulled out her battered med scanner and connected it to the room's main display. Data began flooding the screen. Medical records, treatment logs, evacuation schedules. "Izrathi deployed death pulse weapons designed to kill instantaneously," Lauren said, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a briefing officer. 98% effectiveness against all known galactic species. But humans? were apparently too stubborn to die on schedule. The medical data painted a picture that made several faculty members visibly uncomfortable. Humans fighting with injuries that should have been fatal. Medics treating patients under fire that would send most species into psychological shock. Soldiers carrying wounded teammates for kilometers through enemy territory because leaving them behind simply wasn't considered an option. "This is pathological behavior," Dr. Karras whispered. "No species should be able to function under these stress conditions." Captain Voss laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Pathological. That's what the Zarathi thought too." She stood and walked to the display, highlighting a section of the battlefield map. "See this position? Ridge 394. That's where they cornered my unit. 43 humans against approximately 2,000 Zarathi shock troops. By any rational calculation, we should have surrendered. Instead," Professor Zorin asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Instead, we held that ridge for 6 hours, while Lauren and her team evacuated the wounded. Not because we thought we could win, but because those evac ships needed time to reach minimum safe distance." Lauren's fingers moved across her scanner, bringing up casualty reports. 38 of Captain Voss's soldiers died on that ridge. But the Zarathi lost over 1,500 troops trying to take it. They'd never encountered anything like it before. "Like what?" Admiral Nethera asked. "A species that fights harder when losing than when winning," Captain Voss said simply. "They kept expecting us to break, to run, to do something rational. Instead, we just kept coming. Even when we were dying, we kept coming." The room was dead silent except for the hum of environmental systems. Instructor Grick's optical sensors focused on the data. "The mathematics do not compute. These losses are unsustainable. How did your species survive to develop spaceflight with this